Workflow structured objects are used to implement reproducible research. The iRODS data grid implements the ability to automate the association of input and output files with each execution of a workflow. An example is provided in Chapter 5.6.1 of the Policy Examples Workbook. A workflow structured object is a collection of files associated with each execution of a workflow. The files are organized in a separate workflow collection for each workflow. The files have specific extensions that denote their purpose. Workflow.mss, the workflow text file written using the rule language but without the input or output lines. Parameter.mpf, a parameter file that defines the input parameters and datasets used by the workflow. And workflow.run, a run file created by the data grid for each parameter file. When the .run file is accessed, the workflow is executed. For each execution, a versioned subcollection is created to hold the input and output files. This strongly links the workflow provenance to the workflow results. The sharing of workflows is controlled using the same access control mechanisms provided for data files. You can share the input files, share the output files, share the workflow files, and share the parameter files. Access controls are set on each file and collection to limit who is allowed to use the workflows. Metadata can be added to each file or to the WSO collection itself. The input and output files can be replicated to minimize risk of data loss. However, the .mss file should not be replicated. A standard challenge with workflows is the appropriate naming of the output files. Most applications generate an output file called a.out. When you have multiple a.out files associated with an application, it becomes difficult to determine which output file corresponds to which input data. Workflow structured objects eliminate this problem. The data grid automatically versions the subcollection used to hold the input and output files for each workflow execution. A separate subcollection holds both the input and output files for each execution of the workflow. The subcollection name is derived from the WSO collection name to simplify browsing of workflows. This example uses the iCommand Unix utilities to associate a workflow with the workflow collection and automate the management of the workflow output files. Create a collection that will hold the workflow files. I make dir $rodzone client /home $username client /workflow. The imakedir command makes a collection that we will use to organize the workflow structured objects. Put a workflow file that has an extension .mss into the collection. I put -d msso file .workflow.mss /$rodzone client /home $username client /workflow wkflow.mss. To tell the data grid that this will be a special workflow file, we have to include a data type for the file called msso file. We copy the file from the local directory on the laptop and put the file into the data grid workflow collection. Note that the $rodzone client and $username client should be replaced by your lifelib zone and your account name. Create a WSO collection. I make dir lifelib zone home $username client workflow wk workflow mso. This collection will be linked to the workflow file ending in .mss and will be used to hold the input and output files. Mount the WSO collections as a workflow structured object associated with the workflow file. This command establishes the link between the .mss file and the collection holding the input and output files. imcall -m msso lifelib zone home $username client workflow wk workflow.mss lifelib zone home $username client workflow wkflow mso. The -m option defines the mount point as a workflow structured object by specifying the mount point type as msso. Ingest a parameter file into the WSO collection. The data grid will generate a separate wkflow.run file automatically for each .mpf file. I put wkflow.mpf lifelib zone home $username client workflow wkflow mso. Click on the rule file that is automatically generated for each parameter file to execute the workflow. The workflow parameter file specifies the input parameters, the input files, how the files are staged, and the output files created by the workflow. The parameters that can be used in the file to denote content are In param star file1 equal irods file, input parameters. File param star file1, files used as input. Stage in irods file2, files staged. Copy out workflow file, files copied to WSO. Stage out irods file, files moved from stage to WSO. Check for change irods file, test whether file is changed. If so, the workflow is re-executed. This gives the researcher control over the definition of input required by the workflow, whether input files will be loaded into the output directory, and which output files need to be saved. Take 7 minutes and complete exercise 55. Convert the periodic procedure from the last exercise into a workflow structured object. You will need to create a workflow.mss file and a parameter.mpf file. You will need to use imcall to mount the WSO collection. An example is in Chapter 7.7 of the Policy Examples Workbook. Please load your rule file into the Lifetime Library in the subcollection class INLS 624 by the end of today's class.